Section 3. Section 3 is Samuel and Antonia. Let us now meet the migrants themselves. We begin with one quietly cheerful shelter for asylum seekers. Although the Methodists had started it, quote, we have Unitarians, we have Catholics, we have Presbyterians, Lutherans, and some people who are atheists. I even have a couple of Republicans helping out. They talked to me about the wall, but still here helping out, close quote. In keeping with the regional mood, I was asked not to identify the place in the Tucson foothills, and the co-coordinator who showed me around, she was called Diane, declined to provide her last name because, quote, we're just kind of protecting our folks. We don't want location or names or anything like that because we worry about protesters, close quote. No location then, but I will say that planted in the gravel in front of the building stood a sign from that brave organization, No More Deaths. Humanitarian aid is never a crime. Drop the charges, with a hand reaching up for a water jug somewhere between two saguaro cacti. Diane showed me around. Here was the pantry and the dining space and a room of tightly spaced cots, each with its tucked-in sheets, blanket, and folded towel. On one bed a pair of scissors lay, on another a little book, perhaps the New Testament. On a third a child's dark jacket. And over here and over there rushed that loving woman, one of many good angels, a trifle past middle age, with her sun-damaged skin, her name tag around her neck, and that sweet shining smile, gazing at me with quick ripening trust, and then helping the other volunteers deploy snacks, lunch, and toilet paper from their neatly stacked hoard. As she told their history, quote, this past October we had a church up the street, St. Pius X, get 250 asylum seekers. And then they had a big funeral coming up, so they asked churches in the area to take some of those people, and we were one of them. We had 28 asylum seekers. We had people volunteer and bring stuff. It was amazing, and it was really high stress because we didn't know what we were doing, close quote. After those first migrants had come and gone, quote, the pastor said this is an ongoing problem, close quote. The shelter's adult guests had been kindly provided with ankle bracelets by the U.S. government, which had released them to Diane's organization pending their reception by individual sponsors. Surprised by this humanitarian procedure, I asked the volunteer named Scott why ICE had agreed to it. He said, quote, they were getting into a bind public relations-wise. What first happened was that ICE was just dropping people at the bus station. People were dropped there with no resources and no idea what to do. And there was a big outcry about this, a lot of publicity about what they were doing. It was just a ridiculous situation. So people from the community started volunteering. There were no shelters. They gave them some money, some food, helped them get a bus ticket, helped them understand what would be involved to get going on their way. Quote, the criteria for people that we get is number one, they have to have children with them. Number two, they have to have passed their initial credible fear screening. Number three, they have to not have any criminal record that disqualifies them. Then they have to have a sponsor in the country who will provide them transportation to their location and will guarantee that they will support them economically for whatever period, however many months that is. They are not allowed to work at all. Once that's done, they are released and brought here. And we help them get in touch with their sponsor, who sends them a bus ticket electronically. Then we get them to the bus station with food and warm clothes and whatever they need. Usually they arrive with just whatever they can carry in a small bag and the clothes on their back, which they may be wearing for weeks or months. Quote, we got involved about 2 years ago when ICE made contact with the Bishop of the United Methodist Church, Bishop Robert Hoshibata. At that point, the decision was made here in Tucson that we would start a couple of shelters, close quote. When I asked Diane what brought her into this work, she said, quote, well, we had a person here in sanctuary for a couple of years. One of the things the pastor talked about is, what would you do for another person? This is kind of my answer to that, to show compassion, I guess, and to make their lives less miserable, because I feel like most of this is the fault of the United States, close quote. What do you think about Trump's wall? I think it's ridiculous. Why do you think the people who voted for Trump want this wall? Quote, My personal opinion is that a lot of them just want a country that has white people, and they're worried about not being a majority anymore. Close quote. Among the shelter's inmates was a welder and solar energy worker named Samuel, 29 years old, a little heavy, smooth skinned, with a big round face. I think that must be Samuel there. He smiled when he spoke, sincerely or nervously or meaninglessly. How was I to know? And like so many of these people, to whom their own and others' sufferings must have been old news, he had a way of making light of whatever he must have endured. Squinting at me, he began in his high, pleasant voice. I'm from Honduras, from the Copan ruins. Many trees, very many mountains, many people. It's a city with a lot of people. Close quote. What made you decide to leave home? Open quote. Much insecurity, he immediately replied. Quote, there was no future for the kids. There was no work, nothing for them there. How many in your family? Quote, my wife, my son, and one girl that I left in Honduras. How old is she? 2. Who takes care of her? Quote, my wife, and I came with just my son, Nelson, and my wife stayed with her. Close quote. When I asked him to describe their family conference, he squinted into space and said, quote, well, I had to talk with my wife, and it was pretty obvious that there wasn't a future for the kids, and we were pretty much in agreement that this would be the best option for them. In my country, it's very normal for people to separate because everybody comes here. There's nothing there. Close quote. Why are the conditions so bad in Honduras, and how long have they been bad? Quote, there's no employment. Times have always been bad in Honduras. As long as I can remember, it's been like that. And why? I don't know, but back in 2018, there was an election with a lot of voter fraud. It's always been this way. In Honduras, a president can never be elected twice. When that president took office the first time, he changed the laws so he could be elected again. And everyone said, no, we don't want this, close quote. There's a note here, he probably meant 2017. But why should this have motivated Samuel's migration? When I asked Rachel Wilson how she would characterize typical asylum seekers, she replied, quote, they seem to be mostly women and children coming from Central America, fleeing because of unbearable violence. So if you talk to people, even if the person says to you, I want a better life for my children, if you scratch beneath the surface, they'll say, well, I can't make money because I can't leave the house. And if you ask, why can't you leave your house? They'll say, because I was forced to be a gang member's girlfriend. And when I wanted to leave, he didn't see it that way. I think that some migrants over here, they think it sounds more benign to say, look, I just want a better life. I think that some migrants fear that if they say what an awful time they went through, it may seem that they want a handout. The violence now is at unbelievable levels. No one I've met from there has said, oh yeah, my life has been totally peaceful. Everyone has a murdered family member, or they're threatened with murder. Close quote. None of this apparently fits Samuel's situation, though I never thought to ask him whether he had faced serious intimidation. Rachel now continued, quote, the situation in Honduras is slightly different from the one in El Salvador or Guatemala. But the main reason is that as gangs have taken more and more control of the country, the belief that women are property has taken extreme hold. Someone wants to get out of the relationship, you just kill her. One of my clients, his nephews were killed in front of him because they wouldn't join in. In Honduras, there's a lot of state violence because of the election. Indigenous people are particularly targeted because they are seen as non-human. Close quote. Just across the border in Nogales, Mexico, another doer of good works named Father Sean Carroll ran his own shelter and migrant aid center, and he kept an intake survey. His conclusions differed from Rachel's. Quote, in past years, 88 or 89% are migrating from economic need, but this past month, in January, a significant percentage, about 16%, state fear of violence, close quote. But he very possibly lacked the time to, as Rachel had put it, scratch beneath the surface. So was Samuel merely an economic migrant? He has merely in quotes, an economic migrant, or had he been threatened? All I could say is I never got to know much about him. How many years have you been married? I asked. 7 years. Once you decided to separate, how was the last day at your house with your wife? Quote, very difficult with her father, with her kid. It was very complicated. Close quote. You will hear him employ that characterization more than once, complicated. It connotes nothing pleasant. Quote, tell us about your journey from when you first said goodbye until you came here. Quote, we left on the 22nd of January. This is this year, folks. 22nd of January. And it was very, very difficult. The route for undocumented people is very complicated. Quote, how did you know where to start? Lots of people come here. Did you go to a coyote or did you talk to some friends who came here? No, from Honduras, there's already many caravans. Quote, when was the first caravan? I'm not sure, maybe in the year past, but one just left on the 15th, close quote. How did you hear about the caravans? Open quote. A lot of people come on the train. I left alone. I knew that you look for the trains and you try to find the way north, the route that goes to the border. I brought a phone with me and I was looking at a map to figure out where the border was. Some people go on a bus, some on the train. You have to ask people. What made you decide not to go on the caravan? When I left Honduras, the caravan had already left. Otherwise, would you have taken it? The caravan went to Mexico City, and that's where they rested before they came up here. I asked if he minded missing it. Not really, he replied, smiling a little. The caravan is a lot of people, and it takes more time. Is it safer? Could be, he said, spreading out his hands. I asked him to recount the stages of his journey. Quote, so from Copan, we got to Guatemala by bus. We crossed the border from Guatemala into Mexico. We were 11 people who crossed. We crossed through the mountains so that no one could see us. Not the police, not the border patrol. Who were the other people who crossed with you? We met up on the road with other Hondurans. Did you have any problems in Guatemala? Guatemala, it's not a problem. You can travel through Guatemala with a Honduran passport. What was it like going through the mountains into Mexico? It was pretty simple. You find someone with a truck, you pay them 1,000 Mexican pesos to go 3 hours. All the 11 people paid, and then we got taken further. I don't really remember the names of the cities because we were just rolling. They just leave you in the town and you pick up the next one. Pueblo to pueblo, truck to truck. Close quote. How much did the trip cost? Open quote. Total $1,000 from Honduras for my son and me. What did you think of Mexico? Mexico is very complicated, especially without papers. What was the most scary or dangerous thing that happened to you? The biggest fear is that you get kidnapped. This is a quote. The biggest fear is that you get kidnapped by the criminal groups in Mexico. Quote. Then they start to ask you for your money from your family. Ask you for money from your family. These cartels, close quote, and the most dangerous criminal group, giant cartels. They're big and scary. Did anything bad or scary happen to you on the trip? So it was always pretty scary because you're always running. Every time you got stopped by the cops, you're basically pulling out money. Where did you sleep? We always paid for places to stay, basic dormitories. And then when we arrived in the center of town, we would encounter people who would offer rooms. What was it like for Nelson? He laughed. Well, to bring kids is very difficult. How old is he? He's 7. What things did he say to you during the trip? Open quote. I was telling my son things like we came so you can have a better future for yourself, and we also need to help your mom and your sister back home. My son is very understanding. He would understand all these things. He was pretty chill about it. This is the Fixer's colloquial translation, chill about it. Sometimes he would get hungry and it was difficult, but he was pretty easygoing. Close quote. The boy got hungry. Surely Samuel, too, went without. I never thought to ask those two how thirsty they became because I had not yet been educated by that No More Deaths volunteer who sometimes cached water for migrants. She said, quote, as someone in good health who is relatively young, it's exhausting. For me, when I'm walking, we use GPS, we have established routes, we know where we're going, and we have experience being in this extreme environment. And it's still incredibly taxing to put 3 or 4 gallons in your backpack and to carry 2 on your person and walk for a period of time until you get to the designated water drop. How often do you find living people or dead people? If you look at, quote, if you look at the number of recovered remains, it would even out to one every 3 days. But these numbers don't actually reflect either the people whose bodies we will never find because they have been scattered or deteriorated, and they also don't reflect the people that we know to be disappeared. So we have a missing migrant hotline. So we do know with a certain amount of certainty about the number of people whose family members have been able to place them in this region and then just never heard from them again. The entire map of the Growler Valley, where you see that trail of death that has been brought up in court, there were days when our volunteers would be out for a week and they would find 10 or 11 sets of remains. When you look to the west of that range and you don't see as many red dots, it's only because those are the areas we don't have access to. It doesn't mean the people haven't died there, close quote. Meanwhile, all that Samuel had to say about whatever he went through was, quote, we crossed the river here outside of Nogales in the desert without a coyote, and we got caught by immigration, and then we came here, close quote. He laughed, open quote. The phone worked in Mexico, but once we got here, it was like, we're going for it, and we just crossed, close quote. Which river was it? On Sunday, my fixer and I rolled east along the north side of the border wall and did indeed come to a creek that flowed under a gate. A man and boy might have worked their muddy way through there, although I had subsequent questions about the mafias who controlled the southern side. As for getting caught, well, nothing would have been simpler. A white border patrol vehicle was idling right up the hill. Farther east flowed the Santa Cruz River, and who was Samuel? At the time, I considered him simply calm, brave, intelligent, and competent. When I said as much, he self-deprecatingly replied, very complicated to do this, close quote. As I think back on him, he grows ever more cipher-like to me, being someone whose motives, situation, methods, and future I have now considered for a much longer period than I spent with him. What if he had possessed the superhuman patient openness to answer my questions for a week? Let's just call his journey very complicated. When I asked what had happened after his capture, he replied simply, quote, we signed some papers looking for asylum, and so I got an ankle bracelet. I was held in detention for 3 days with my son. ICE took me here. ICE gave us the bracelet and took us here, close quote. What do you think of our President Trump? He smiled, open quote. Trump's talked about in all countries, and he doesn't like immigrants, but because we have no opportunity in our country, we have to come here, close quote. So what do you hope for from the United States? Quote, I have no idea, close quote. At my request, he stepped into the sun to be photographed, pulling up his left pants cuff to show my camera that black insignia of humiliation around his ankle. The bracelet. Next was Antonia. I think we'll pause here because we've gotten to 18 minutes. The next will be part 3. We are reading William T. Vollman's accounts at the U.S.-Mexico border. Just Keep Going North. It was published last month in Harper's Magazine. Part 3 is next.